The dealer had driven out personally. That was the first thing people noticed. Not a sales rep, not a junior associate with a brochure and a payment calculator. The dealer himself, a man named Phil Garrett, who had run the largest John Deere operation in the county for 22 years and who did not make farm calls unless the number on the invoice justified the drive. Phil had driven 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning to sit across a kitchen table from a farmer named Warren Holt and present an offer that, by any reasonable measure, was a good one. The machine was a late-model John Deere 8R, loaded, guidance system, variable rate technology, telematics package, the full complement of precision agriculture tools that the manufacturer's representatives had spent the better part of a decade telling farmers they could no longer afford to operate without. The trade-in allowance on Warren's existing equipment was fair. The financing rate was better than fair. Phil Garrett had structured the deal with the specific care of a man who understood that Warren Holt's operation was the kind of account that anchored a territory. Warren looked at the paperwork for a long time. Phil waited. He was a patient man when patience was required. Warren pushed the paperwork back across the table and said no. Phil asked if the number was the issue. Warren said the number wasn't the issue. Phil asked if the financing terms were the issue. Warren said they weren't. Phil, who had been selling equipment for more than 2 decades and had developed an instinct for the specific texture of different kinds of resistance, asked Warren what the issue was. Warren said he was going a different direction. That was all he said, a different direction. No further explanation. No indication of what direction, or why, or what it would cost, or what he expected it to return. Phil Garrett drove 40 minutes back to his dealership with an unsigned contract and no understanding of what had just happened. The different direction turned out to be a Massey Ferguson. Not a new one. A used MF 7S series that Warren had found through a private sale 3 counties over. A machine with hours on it. A machine that required work before it was field ready. A machine that Warren paid for in cash and trailered home on a Thursday afternoon without telling anyone he was going. His neighbor, Gene Purvis, saw the trailer come through and called his wife, who mentioned it to her sister, who mentioned it at the hair salon on Friday morning. By Saturday afternoon, the county knew that Warren Holt had turned down Phil Garrett's John Deere deal and bought a used Massey Ferguson with cash. The reaction was not charitable. At the elevator that week, the conversation had the specific tone of a community processing something it didn't understand and had therefore decided to interpret as error. Warren had always been considered a sound operator, not flashy, not the kind of man who put new equipment in the field every 3 years to signal prosperity, but steady, reliable. The kind of farmer whose decisions other farmers watched because his decisions had a way of being correct in the long run, even when they weren't obvious in the short run. But this didn't look like a long-run decision. This looked like stubbornness, or nostalgia, or the particular hardening that sometimes came over men of a certain age when they felt the industry moving away from what they understood. Gene Purvis said Warren had always had a soft spot for that brand going back to his father's time, said it was sentiment, not strategy. Others weren't so sure. Warren wasn't a sentimental man in any visible way. He didn't keep things because they reminded him of something. He kept things because they worked. But nobody could get a straight answer out of Warren, so the speculation filled the silence the way speculation always does in a small county. To understand Warren Holt's decision, you have to understand Warren Holt. He had farmed that ground for 34 years, started with 80 acres that his father left him and a debt load that should have broken a younger man or a less stubborn one, built it to 640 acres over the course of 2 decades, through a combination of cash purchases when cash was available, rented ground when cash wasn't, and a discipline around operating costs that his ag lender described, more than once, as almost unreasonable. Warren tracked every cost to the cent, not in a computerized system, in notebooks, the same brand of notebook purchased at the same hardware store in town, replaced when full, stored in a box in the back bedroom that now held 31 years of operational data in Warren's own handwriting. Fuel costs, parts costs, labor hours, yield by field, by year, by hybrid, downtime events and their duration and their cause and their cost. 31 years of notebooks. The ag lender had once asked Warren, during a particularly tight operating year, how he managed to maintain his margins when larger operations around him were getting squeezed. Warren had opened one of the notebooks and pointed to a number. The number was the per-acre cost of an unplanned downtime event during harvest, not just the repair cost, but the full cost including lost opportunity, drying costs, quality degradation, and hired labor at emergency rates. That number was large, much larger than most people calculated when they thought about equipment failure, because most people calculated the repair bill and stopped there. Warren calculated everything, had been calculating everything for 31 years. The ag lender had looked at that number and understood something about Warren Holt that Phil Garrett had not understood on the Tuesday morning when he drove 40 minutes out and drove 40 minutes back with an unsigned contract. Warren wasn't buying equipment, he was buying a cost structure. The Massey Ferguson took 3 weeks to prepare for field work. Warren did most of the work himself, with parts sourced directly from the dealer, and one assistance visit from a mechanic he had used for 15 years, a man named Albert, who had forgotten more about practical field mechanics than most certified technicians ever learned. Albert looked at the machine on the first day and said it was solid underneath the cosmetic issues. Said whoever had run it before had maintained the mechanicals even when they'd let the appearance go. Warren had known that before he bought it. He had inspected the machine twice before making the offer, had brought Albert on the second inspection, had gone through the service history with the same methodical attention he brought to everything that entered his operation. The price he paid reflected the cosmetic condition and the hours and the age. It did not reflect the mechanical condition, which was better than the price suggested. Warren understood the difference. The seller, who needed to move the machine quickly for reasons unrelated to its performance, did not fully understand that Warren understood the difference. That was a transaction that went one direction. He put the Massey Ferguson in the field in late May, 3 weeks behind where he'd wanted to be. The lost weeks bothered him. He wrote the cost of the delay in the notebook, but the alternative would have been rushing a preparation that couldn't be rushed. And rushing preparation on field equipment was a category of error Warren had written about in the notebooks more than once. Never rush the preparation. The field will wait. The machine won't forgive it. The first season passed without drama. That was the most honest way to describe it. No dramatic proof of anything. No moment that made the county reconsider its assessment. The Massey Ferguson ran Warren's ground the way any well-maintained machine runs well-maintained ground, steadily, without spectacle, completing the work that needed to be done at the cost that Warren had planned for. He finished planting within his target window. He finished the season's field work without an unplanned mechanical stop. He finished harvest 8 days before the first hard frost, which was 2 days inside his target window, and 3 days ahead of the county average, as reported informally through the network of conversations that happened at the elevator and the co-op through November. Nobody made much of it. One good season proved nothing. The John Deere 8R that Phil Garrett had offered was also a reliable machine. Anyone who suggested otherwise was arguing against evidence that didn't exist. The Massey Ferguson had run well in its first season. So had every other machine on every other farm in the county, more or less, because the first season had been cooperative, and cooperative seasons hide the differences between operations that the hard seasons reveal. Gene Purvis mentioned, at the elevator in December, that his new equipment had put in a strong first year, said the precision guidance system had saved him an estimated 12% on input costs through reduced overlap. Said the numbers were there in the data, the telematics system generated automatically. Warren listened and said that sounded good. He went home and opened the notebook and wrote down what Gene had said. Not dismissively, with genuine attention. Because Warren Holt was not a man who dismissed information, even information that seemed to argue against a position he had taken. He wrote it down and looked at it and thought about it. Then he wrote something underneath it. He wrote, "Telematics saves overlap." Who pays for the telematics when the system fails at 4 in the morning in October? He closed the notebook and went to bed. The second year was when things started to separate, not catastrophically, not in any single moment that the county pointed to as definitive. Slowly, the way real separations happen in farming, across a season, across a series of small decisions and small differences that compound into something visible only when you step back far enough to see the shape of them. Gene Purvis had a telematics failure in June. The guidance system went down on a Tuesday during a critical application window, the kind of window where timing matters and waiting costs money. The dealer's service department was backed up with 3 other calls. Gene waited until Thursday for a technician. The application happened Thursday afternoon, 2 days outside the optimal window. Gene absorbed it. He was philosophical about it publicly. Said it was a first-year issue. Said the dealer had been responsive. Said the system was back up and performing. All of that was true. But 2 days outside the optimal application window in June is a number. And numbers have consequences that show up in yield data in October and in the notebooks of men who track such things to the cent. Warren had no telematics failure in June because Warren had no telematics system. He had an operator himself who had been reading the same ground for 34 years and whose judgment about application timing was built on 34 years of observing what that specific soil did under specific conditions. That judgment was not quantifiable in the way a precision agriculture system's output was quantifiable. It did not generate reports. It did not produce data visualizations. It produced correct decisions made at the right time without system failures. Those decisions did not make the news at the elevator. They just showed up in October. The hard year came in the third season. Weather in late August, a stretch of conditions that arrived earlier than the historical pattern suggested it should, and stayed longer than any reasonable forecast had predicted. The kind of weather that compresses harvest windows and breaks the operations that were always relying on everything going according to plan. 2 things happened simultaneously across the county that September. The first was that several operations running the newest generation of precision-equipped machines found themselves waiting for dealer support during the compressed window. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough of them that the elevator conversations in October had a different texture than they'd had in the 2 previous years. Technician availability, which was already strained under normal conditions, became a genuine constraint when multiple machines in the same geography needed attention in the same compressed window. Parts that were standard inventory items became back-ordered items because the regional distribution system had not been designed to absorb simultaneous demand spikes of this magnitude. The second thing was that Warren Holt ran his harvest from the first day of the window to the last without stopping, not because he was lucky. Not because the Massey Ferguson was a superior machine in some absolute engineering sense, but because of a specific combination of factors that Warren had been calculating in his notebooks for 3 years before anyone else understood what he was calculating. Factor 1, he knew the machine. Not from a service history in a dealer's database. From his own hands, his own hours, his own accumulated understanding of exactly how that specific machine behaved under the specific conditions of his specific ground. When something sounded slightly different in the second week of September, Warren heard it before it became a problem. He addressed it at 4 in the morning on a day when the weather was holding, costing himself 2 hours of downtime by choice, avoiding a catastrophic failure that would have cost him 8 to 12 days by necessity. Factor 2, his parts inventory. Warren had carried a specific set of critical parts for that machine since the first season. Not a large inventory, a targeted one, built from 31 years of understanding which parts failed under which conditions and how much lead time a replacement required. He had paid for those parts to sit on a shelf in his equipment shed. He wrote that cost in the notebook every year under the heading, Insurance that doesn't require a phone call to collect. Factor 3, his cost structure. Because Warren had bought the Massey Ferguson in cash at a price that reflected a market misunderstanding of its actual mechanical condition, His fixed cost per acre was substantially lower than the operations around him that were carrying manufacturer financing on late-model precision equipment. That lower fixed cost meant that Warren's margin, in the compressed conditions of the 3rd September, was a cushion, not a large one. But agriculture does not require large cushions. It requires cushions that are real rather than theoretical. He finished harvest on September 28th. The county average was October 9th, 11 days. Phil Garrett heard the number at the elevator in November. He heard it the way you hear something that recontextualizes information you've been carrying in an incomplete form for 3 years. He drove out to Warren's farm in December, not to sell anything. Phil was too experienced a man to misread the moment that badly. He drove out because 22 years in the equipment business had given him an instinct for the difference between a farmer who had gotten lucky and a farmer who had been right, and Phil Garrett had a professional obligation to himself to understand the difference. Warren made coffee. They sat at the same kitchen table where Phil had pushed the John Deere contract across 3 years earlier. Phil asked Warren to explain the decision. Warren got one of the notebooks. Not the most recent one, the one from the year before he turned down the contract. He opened it to a page near the middle and turned it so Phil could read what was written there. Phil read it. He sat with it for a moment. What was written there was not a condemnation of John Deere equipment or of precision agriculture technology or of Phil Garrett's dealership or its service department. What was written there was a specific calculation. Warren's estimate, built from 30 years of operational data, of the per-acre cost difference between 2 equipment strategies across a 10-year horizon that included 2 normal years, 1 cooperative year, 1 difficult year, and 1 hard year. The calculation assumed no extraordinary failures on either side. It assumed maintenance costs at historical averages. It assumed parts availability at current regional norms. It assumed dealer service response times at documented averages, not best-case scenarios. Under those assumptions, over a 10-year period that included the distribution of year types that Warren's 30 years of data suggested was realistic for this geography, the Massey Ferguson strategy was cheaper per acre by a number that was not enormous in any given year, but was consistent across all year types, including the hard ones, especially the hard ones, and that consistency was the point. Phil Garrett looked at the calculation for a long time. Then he said, "You did this before I came out." Warren said yes. Phil said, "You knew before I drove out here." Warren said he thought he knew. Said there was a difference between thinking you know and knowing. Said the 3 years had been the confirmation, not the decision. The decision had been made at that kitchen table, on the basis of 30 years of notebooks and the specific calculation Phil was looking at. Phil nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He said, "I'm going to think about what you've shown me for a while." Warren said that seemed right. What Phil Garrett thought about across that winter was a question that the equipment industry had been asking itself for a decade without arriving at a satisfying answer. At what point does technology become a liability rather than an asset? And for which operations, under which conditions? The industry's instinct was that more technology was always better, that the precision agriculture revolution was an unambiguous advancement, that the data and the guidance and the telematics were strictly additive, that any farmer who wasn't adopting them was leaving money in the field, and for many operations under many conditions, that instinct was correct. But Warren Holt's notebooks told a more complicated story. The story the notebooks told was about the relationship between technology adoption and operational resilience, about the difference between a system that performs well under normal conditions and a system that holds together when conditions compress, about the specific vulnerability that comes with complexity, not in the engineering sense, but in the support ecosystem sense. When a precision agriculture system fails during a compressed harvest window, the solution is not inside the farmer's equipment shed. It is inside a dealer's service department, or inside a manufacturer's remote diagnostic system, or inside a parts distribution network that was not designed for simultaneous regional demand. The farmer is dependent on a chain of responses that he does not control and cannot accelerate. Warren's operation was not without dependencies. Every farming operation is dependent on systems outside itself. But Warren had built his dependencies toward the narrow and the knowable, toward a machine he understood, toward a parts inventory he controlled, toward a mechanic he had worked with for 15 years who answered his phone on Saturday mornings. That architecture of dependency had held when the hard year came. Phil Garrett could not honestly say that every operation running his dealership's most advanced equipment could make the same claim. He called Warren in February. Not to pitch anything, to ask a question. He asked Warren whether, given the calculations in the notebooks, he saw a version of the technology adoption story that worked for an operation like his, a scaled-up version, a different support model, something that changed the dependency architecture enough to change the calculation. Warren said he thought about that, said he didn't rule anything out on principle, said the notebooks didn't argue against technology on principle, said they argued against a specific cost structure, under specific conditions, for a specific operation size and geography. Said a different operation, larger acreage, different geography, different capital position, might run the same calculation and arrive at a different answer. Phil said that was a more nuanced answer than he'd expected. Warren said he'd had 3 years to think about it. Phil laughed. It was the first time either of them had laughed in any of their conversations. The following spring, Gene Purvis stopped at Warren's equipment shed on his way past. Not for any particular reason, he stated. Just stopped. He looked at the Massey Ferguson for a minute without saying anything. Then he asked Warren what his per-acre operating cost had come in at for the previous year. Warren told him. Gene stood there with that number for a moment. Then he said, "Mine was higher." Warren said he knew. Gene asked how he knew. Warren said the elevator numbers gave you enough to work backward from if you knew what questions to ask and you'd been asking them long enough. Gene nodded. He said, "Phil's got a used unit on the lot. Different brand, less complexity, reasonable price." Warren said he'd heard that. Gene said, "I'm going out to look at it Thursday." Warren said that sounded like a reasonable thing to do. Gene left. Warren went back into the shed and opened the notebook and wrote the date and one sentence. The sentence was about the specific moment when a county's understanding of something shifts. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic event, but in the accumulation of individual conversations at individual equipment sheds on individual spring mornings. The way understanding actually moves through a community of people who have been watching the same ground and the same numbers and the same equipment long enough to see what the patterns are telling them. He wrote that sentence and closed the notebook. Outside, the ground was soft enough to work. The Massey Ferguson was ready. It had been ready for 3 years. The county found out the same way the county always finds out. Not from Warren, who never said a word about it publicly, and not from Phil Garrett, who was a man who understood that some lessons landed better when people arrived at them on their own terms. The county found out from the numbers, from 11 days in September, from the yield data that moved through the elevator conversations in October, from the per-acre cost comparisons that sharp-eyed operators reconstructed from public information across 3 seasons of watching, from the notebooks that Warren never showed anyone except Phil Garrett on a December afternoon, and which contained 34 years of a man paying close enough attention to his own operation that when the moment came to make a decision, the decision was already made. Had been made for years. Was written down in pencil, in a specific notebook, on a specific page, before Phil Garrett ever drove 40 minutes out to a kitchen table with a contract that was, by any reasonable measure, a good one. Warren Holt had turned down that contract because the notebooks told him to. 3 years later, the whole county understood why. Not because Warren told them, because the ground told them. The ground always tells the truth eventually. Warren had just learned to read it earlier than most.